my colleague, Kimberly Rose, serves as the co-director of the University of Florida's Preservation Institute Nantucket. She's lived here year-round for a little over 2 years now. She is also a preservation associate at the Craig Group, where she's worked on projects that further strengthen her community engagement toolkit and knowledge of what it means for historic communities to be resilient. She has a master's degree in historic preservation from the University of Florida and a Bachelor of Science from Martin Methodist College. And Kim was also the founder and coordinator of the Acclimate Nantucket group and a graduate of the Preservation Institute Nantucket, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. NPT is celebrating our 25th anniversary, so we're getting up there. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and she's going to tell us all about what she's been at work the last couple of months.
Thank you so much, Mary. So again, my name is Kimberly Rose, and just really quickly, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary at the Preservation Institute Nantucket. And this is the save the date if you would like to learn more about the events that are going to occur or how to get involved in the program. The website is below, dcp.ufl.edu/historic preservation/pin 50. So in this event, we're going to do a little bit of everything. So talking about the first 3 tasks of the project, we'll discuss a little bit of the methodology. We'll walk through a context statement, also look at the historic research, our findings from our field and data collection experiences, and what's coming up next in this month for the project. So like Mary said, this is funded by the Nantucket CPC. Our partners are the Nantucket Historical Commission and the Nantucket Preservation Trust. And really what brought this all together was the realization that no one had actually studied the historic streetscapes in their material nature. And so our goal is to document those materials and the streetscapes in order to develop strategies and form prioritized plan to address maintenance, code issues, and the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we're doing that through the tasks of documentation, assessment of existing conditions, conducting archival research, engaging our stakeholders, which is what we are doing today, preparing a master plan, and then disseminating that information to the public. The locations we researched are Winter Street, Liberty Street, and Center Street, and we'll get a little bit more into why those streets were chosen later. Really briefly, this is a scary chart of our methodology, but really what you need to know is research, documentation, and public engagement are the 3 fundamental cogs to the clock that is the Nantucket Town Historic Streetscapes Preservation Master Plan. This will go into a GIS database so that it is accessible parcel by parcel of information, including the data that we collected in the field, the field photographs, and historic photographs courtesy of the Nantucket Historical Association. So this is a simplified version of that scary methodology chart, once again showing the 3 cogs that create this plan and make sure that the plan, the resulting plan is feasible and relevant for Nantucket streetscapes. So we're looking at documentation and assessment. We looked at Winter Street completely, so both sides of the sidewalk, and that was done manually. Then Liberty Street, the north side was a manual documentation. The south side was digital. We used a 3D laser scanner and photogrammetry to do that, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. And then Center Street was also digital documentation, and it was the east sidewalk. So when talking about manual documentation, I had 2 students from the Preservation Institute last summer to assist with the project, as they're pictured here on the right. We measured the length, width, and height of every curb. We made sure that our brick size was average as we moved down the sidewalk. And you'll see when we get to Liberty Street that measuring the curbs was a little bit difficult because of the parked cars. So we made multiple trips to Liberty Street in order to try to maneuver around those, because we didn't want to stick a tape measure under somebody's SUV. It's not the best move. But what we did is also measured the entire length of the sidewalk and the width so that we could say, okay, we have this amount of area covered in brick, this many linear feet of granite. We also looked at utilities and sidewalk features, such as what Elizabeth is doing in this photo, is she's measuring the clearance between that signpost and the edge of the sidewalk to look at accessibility concerns and whether somebody in a wheelchair or another assisted device could have room enough to move through that area, but also to see what the impact of those utilities or sidewalk furniture possibly has on how it's used as well. And this is the kind of the considerations that we make moving through our research and into our documentation, is keeping that in the back of our mind is, okay, looking at this from different perspectives. So then we moved into digital documentation, and my colleague at the University of Florida, Dr. Sujin Kim, flew to Nantucket for a weekend shortly before Halloween, where we conducted 3D documentation using photogrammetry and terrestrial laser scanning methods. Now, those are big words, and not a lot of people know what they mean, so I'm going to back up for a moment. Photogrammetry is using photographs to create a map, drawing, measurement, or 3D models. One of the most common forms of photogrammetry that many of us are familiar with is Google Street View. Simply a series of photographs stitched together to create this visual field experience. When we moved to terrestrial laser scanning, also called LiDAR or light detection and ranging, that is a remote capturing method using light in the form of a laser that is just bouncing off and bringing us back data. Our terrestrial laser scanner is accurate to 3 millimeters. It is incredibly efficient for us to gather a lot of information in a quick amount of time. Each scan takes about 6 minutes. So we can move pretty quickly, whereas with photogrammetry, we're taking thousands of photos manually as we're moving in a grid pattern through the sidewalk. So that takes a little bit longer. So when we move into digital documentation, this is what we did. We selected our subjects, our study areas, due to their historic significance, use, and condition. We had originally planned to laser scan the north block of Main Street from Federal to Center. However, I made the decision in the field to laser scan the south side of Liberty Street. This decision was made because of the amount of people on Main Street. When you're using photogrammetry, you can't have too much interference with the photo, or else you're not going to get the data. So it was not feasible or practical use of resources in order to do that. But what that allowed us to do was laser scan the other side of Liberty Street in order to compare to our manual documentation of the north side. So with every pass, we're taking photos constantly. And it just wasn't feasible to stop traffic on Main Street. So Sujin can pass by with the camera and take 100 photos. The section of Liberty Street we scanned was approximately 500 feet long, 4 feet wide. We took a total of 1,345 photographs to make the 3D model. However, we took even more photos than that. Center Street from India to Maine was 275 feet long, 12 feet wide. We took 2,517 photographs there. And those create amazing high resolution, data-packed images and what we call orthographic images. So these are measurable, they are in color, and it's 3D data. The top crosscut section shows slope and uneven surface of the sidewalk along an observed primary walking path. So people aren't walking on one side or the other. They're most likely going to walk down the middle where it's comfortable. So this is where we observe the most people walking. So that's where we made this crosscut section. The vertical movement is difficult to describe when it comes to manual documentation, unless you have the proper surveying tools. But with a laser scanner, we can look at this and go, ah, yes, there's a hump there in the middle of the sidewalk that could possibly trip people up. But when it comes to looking at materials, we can also see this outside of the field as well. And that's what benefits. If you can't be somewhere for a long time, then digital documentation is a great option. We can also see, which we can observe during manual documentation, discoloration of bricks from possibly replacements. We can see water drainage where water isn't moving away or isn't drying very quickly and thus causing material growth on the surface of the bricks. And then we can also see other material growth under the trees because once again, it's shaded, it's just not going to dry as quickly. So moss and lichens really like it. But it also gives us this gorgeous view as well. This is not a photograph. This is thousands of little laser specks bouncing off of surfaces turned into data. Neither method is perfect, nor does it create a complete understanding without interpretation. Methodology is driven by the desired result. If something is not changing constantly, then manual measurement suffices. However, this does not mean change does not happen at all. Dr. Kim was here shortly before the storm prior to Halloween last year. We had a massive storm, as many of you know, and lost a tree right across the street from where we had worked on Center Street. And the entire feel of that street changed because of that loss and the infill of brick. A new tree was not planted, it is brick. And of course, now I, as a researcher, regret not going that extra small little block to get the other corner as we laser scan, because it did change the feeling of that corner significantly and our understanding of how to navigate it. But this information that we gathered through the digital documentation and the manual documentation really helps inform the research and vice versa. We used a number of resources, and what you see on your screen is by no means the exhaustive list of articles and resources that I have read, but this is to provide a good idea of what we have looked at. Some are more local sources, like the Nantucket Historical Association, the Nantucket Athenaeum, the Town Archives, and Hillary Hedges Rayport's Cobblestone article. Others are regional, like the Archpedia New England, which has a fantastic collection of resources about paving materials and how to treat them in preservation. But also there are more broad, like Historic Pavement by Dr. Robin Williams at Savannah College of Art and Design, and Dublin, Ireland's Conservation of Historic Ground Surfaces Plan, which also looks at a lot of the materials that we have here. So all of these items provide guidance, but also there are historic districts within the US that have also done streetscape studies. And so those will also help inform the plan for Nantucket as well. But the research, current conditions assessment, and your engagement informs what we call a context statement. And a historic context statement is essentially a summary of the themes relevant to the history and development of resources. Statements can be pages long for articles on historic districts or a paragraph for a resource. So our current context statement is Nantucket's history is one of dynamic transformation. From changes in industry to economic booms and depressions, Nantucket has developed a unique identity. Along the way, the development of streetscapes has followed this pattern by change in materials, paths, and experience. Cobblestones, stone curbs, brick sidewalks, tree canopies, and the nostalgic bollards and hitching posts support this intense sense of place and further the vivid identity of Nantucket. And so, all of that being said, if you go back to 1882, Edward Godfrey wrote this quote, which is one of my favorites when I came across during research. The streets of the town are narrow and crooked. The number of them are paved with the most excruciating of all torments of man or beast, the cobblestone. Very little time or money is expended on them. I love this quote. And the reason I love it is because it's not the cobblestone's fault that maintenance was not kept up. Also notice when it was written, 1882. This is after the fall of the whaling. And so Nantucket was trying to find its stable economic boon. It makes sense that road maintenance and streetscapes were not a high priority when nobody knew where the coffers were going to be filled again. So whose job was it to maintain the streets? And that fell to a position called the Surveyor of Highways. This position started as a British parliamentary law in 1555, so we're going all the way back, but don't worry, we'll race forward. It was eventually picked up in Massachusetts in the Providence Laws of 1693 in an act for highways, which required towns to have 2 surveyor of highways. This was then expanded upon again and said, okay, the justice of the peace and the selectmen have to select those people. But even after the American Revolution, Massachusetts maintained this position of surveyor of highways, except now they were chosen with democracy, a ballot at town meeting. On Nantucket, this position was prestigious, with well-known names holding the position as seen in 1825 newspaper article, with names of Starbuck and Hussey and Folger and Barney dotting these positions for a very long time. But when the economic vitality began to dip after the Great Fire of 1846, so did the position of Surveyor of Highways, and thus the maintenance of historic streets. There was a pattern of uncertainty, and the title of Surveyor of Highways fell in and out of fashion for many years, until it finally ceased to exist in about 1890. Nantucket was not able to commit funds to street maintenance when other functions of the town demanded the resources that were already very limited. This is why when we look at photographs from the 1870s to about the 1920s, the streets can look a little rough, which aligns with what our friend Godfrey stated in his musings of Nantucket cobblestones and his disgust of them. A proper highway department was not even mentioned until 1894 in the paper, and then they were sparsely funded. A state highway department even tried to send people over to assist in maintenance and preparation, but the select board member that was supposed to attend the meeting didn't attend, and nobody ordered the doors to be unlocked for the state, so they went home. Once again, there was still this uncertainty of who is supposed to maintain the roads, and you had people like the Macy family that lived on Main Street that said, well, we're going to fix the sidewalk. Here's the money, town. Please find somebody to do the work. And that was regularly praised in newspapers, especially during the 19th century. So moving into modern day, we'll go a little bit back in history and look at Winter Street. And so Winter Street is, of course, the street that we digitally documented. And the reason we chose it is because of the sewer line that runs underneath it, and the constant disruption of materials that has happened throughout the history of this street. Even currently, there are cobblestones under the asphalt. But if we go all the way back to 1853, there's an annual meeting notice that says to see if town will pave the upper part of Liberty Street and build a brick sewer from Main to Pearl, which is modern day India Street, commencing and running through Winter Street. So already in 1853, they were digging up the road to build a brick sewer. By 1870, Winter Street is cobblestone. The sidewalk appears unpaved, however. And so you can see in this photo, you see the cobblestone, then there's a brick or a stone curb. However, it's not very well placed. It's not very clearly defined. It's not actually really going to protect a sidewalk. But the reason we say that the sidewalk is dirt is because if you zoom in greatly into the photo, you can't discern any pattern of brick. And also you can see where water has started to undermine the sidewalk of the coffin school as well, which is where what the two circles are indicating. By 1905, Winter Street is cobblestone and the sidewalks are brick. So they fix it pretty quickly. And there is a discernible difference between the street and what is sidewalk, but it also creates a nicer transition between public and private space. There's also, of course, a utility pool now outside of the coffin school. And moving a little bit further down the street, to the next building, you can see in the street there is a crosswalk, which does not exist today, but it's a flagstone crosswalk set into the Cobblestone Road. In 1930, the road and sidewalk are asphalt. And yes, I did mean sidewalk. The west sidewalk remains brick. So we had some discussion when we saw this photo about whether this was showing asphalt or showing concrete. And we decided that it was asphalt because it has a rugged edge. And also the way that it has pushed the stone curbs over. And that's because asphalt and stone have different expansion and contraction rates. And that has caused the asphalt to start to crack and become a little bit of a hazard in that form. But of course, today, that side of the sidewalk is brick, but it wasn't always. And so that brings up a discussion of when we say historic, what does that mean? Because for historic preservationists like myself, we go by a period of significance, 1975 and prior. Technically, asphalt is prior to 1975. And so does that mean it is a historic material for Nantucket? Now, moving into 1936, there was a select board meeting discussing parking. And you'll understand the reason that I bring this up and thought it was significant enough to put in this PowerPoint a little bit later. But essentially what they're saying is you cannot park on the west side, which is the side in front of the coffin school. You have to park on the east side, and we're taking out the signs, that kind of thing. And they don't settle this discussion until much later. It continues to go on. In 1964, Winter Street is asphalt. The west sidewalk is brick and the east sidewalk is still asphalt, as we can see here. So in that lower left corner, you can see the east sidewalk, asphalt, the road's asphalt. The west sidewalk is still brick with stone curbing. And then finally, we get to 1984, to the select board meeting that says, okay, enough discussion, left side only is parking, no need to park on the sidewalk, there's plenty of room for passage, one-way street. And this is important because when we look at what we are seeing in the field in our existing condition survey, we're seeing a little bit of conflict with that, especially in the material realm, but also in safety. So our primary materials, brick sidewalks, granite curbs, asphalt roads. We measured 7 sections because there's 7 parcels that line the sidewalk. So essentially what we did, we took the property line and dragged it out onto the sidewalk. The length of area surveyed is 564.35 feet down both sides. So one side and then the other equal that. And then the average width of area surveyed is 5.59 feet. So this sidewalk is not very wide on average. There is a number of utilities, including signposts, curb boxes, fire alarms, electric access, utility poles and anchors, water meters, and the little water meter medallions, which are like 3 inches by 3 inch medallions. And then accessibility, there's an experience of tight spaces, but also vehicles driving on the sidewalk. And these are rather large vehicles. But before we get to that, I want to show you what Fieldwork looks like in the best way I possibly can, which is a lot of arrows and lines. So we broke our sections down into smaller sections. So this is the very first section that we looked at. It is 83 Main Street on the Winter Street side of it. And basically what we did, we measured the entire width of the sidewalk, then the width of just the brick, so we can take an area of the historic brick material, measured the entire length, looked at what the primary materials are, which is brick and granite, but we also looked for if there was fill, which you can see circled in red, as well as what the pattern of brick is, which is just a simple running bond. We also, of course, like I said at the beginning, measured the length, width, and height of every single curb. And the reason we did that is because of the fill. If you wanted to get rid of this concrete with aggregate fill, you know, okay, curb number 2 is 3 feet, and the length of that fill is 3 inches. So we need a piece of granite that is 3 feet, 3 inches to get rid of that concrete, so we have a cohesive picture of granite side curbing. We also looked at the impact of utilities and sidewalk features. So this signpost, which is 3.5 inches square, required a little stretcher brick to be placed in order to maintain that pattern, which is a nice little detail. So when we get to talking about the accessibility of Winter Street, looking at the western sidewalk first, it is wide, it is relatively flat with very few obstacles. However, vehicles drive on this sidewalk to avoid the cars that are parked along the eastern side. And this has caused some material damage. As you can see in the image on the right, the sidewalk has started to almost form a wave. And it's because the bedding material and the bricks themselves are not meant to carry the weight of a car or a large vehicle, not even a car. And so it's starting to compress and starting to kind of create a difficult passage. As you can see, it's causing material migration. There's a larger gap between the bricks on the left side of the sidewalk than there is against the curb. The curbs are also starting to lean towards the road as vehicles come on and off of it. And so, for example, this truck, he was very nice, tried to avoid making me move on the sidewalk, but drove along the curb the entire time. And me being me was just like, oh, I wish you wouldn't do that. But we also had a moment of where I needed to think about the safety of our project. I had both of my students out, and this was the very last parcel that we were working on on the street. And we were, all three of us were kneeling and taking measurements and this, that, and the other. And barreling around the corner was a FedEx truck. And all three of us pressed ourselves as flat as we possibly could get against the stairs and the fence of the house. And of course, the FedEx driver stopped when he saw us and got out of the truck and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you." And so I had to think about, okay, is what we're doing actually safe? Because I needed to protect our students, but also it made me think about children, people that aren't at full adult height. Because I'm 5'10", so it's kind of, I'm taller than the average female even. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what risk does that pose? Because it is larger vehicles that are forced to drive on the sidewalk due to the room of the road. And so there's a little bit of a pedestrian safety issue when it comes to that, and thinking about children and thinking about people who are in wheelchairs or using assistive devices that may not be easy to see. Looking at the eastern sidewalk, it is narrow. There's uneven ground, mainly because utilities sometimes aren't flush with the pavement. And so that can cause tripping hazards, that can cause a wheelchair or other assistive devices to get caught, which can cause a risk of falling. But also there's multiple obstacles and tight spaces. And so you have a risk on one side of possibly having to dive out of the way of a fast moving vehicle driving on the sidewalk, or on the other side, not being able to actually go past an obstacle. And this is one of the places where that really shows. So this space between the stairs and the outside edge of the curb is 2.9 feet. There is a utility that pops up. So this is a utility cover. There's actually a water main underneath this wood cover. So that is a tripping hazard. It's not a lot of room. And that's not accounting for the car mirror that's hanging over the sidewalk. So it's very difficult to pass by, especially if you were somebody who needed more room for a wheelchair or other device in order to help you navigate that sidewalk. And so that's when we start to really be concerned about accessibility. Now, looking at Liberty Street and going through this history, we chose Liberty Street because of the historic materials, because of the cobblestone roads, because it's also a nice transition street from town to a residential area. So in 1845, the NHA has this photo, and I absolutely love it. It's likely one of the only photographs before the Great Fire, as they say, and it's looking at the area of the Methodist Church. There is not a brick and flagstone crossing from the Pacific Bank to the Methodist Church sidewalk like there is today. There is a sidewalk in front of the Methodist Church. However, it's not very easy to discern what the material is. However, because of the presence of the bollards, I like to think that it's brick. However, we're not entirely sure just because of the quality of the photograph. But by 1865, photograph quality has improved a little bit. And we can see there's a cobblestone road, there's a brick sidewalk, there's a nice little crossing for these lovely people to use on their day in Nantucket. By 1880, the road is still cobblestone, the sidewalk is still brick, and there is a stone curb, but you can see that some of the maintenance has started to be deferred. Like our friend Godfrey said at the very beginning of the history section, cobblestones are the bane of man's existence. And you can see that here, the cobblestones are kind of rough, but also the sidewalk is getting rough. Especially behind the woman, you can see the bricks are starting to be pushed up against the house. There are these lovely bollards or hitching posts, whichever you would like to call it. The one that is closest to the camera is standing up nice and straight. However, the one closer to the Methodist Church is starting to lean, and that can cause the material, most likely the brick, to lift up, the curb to start to lean out into the road, and then the road material to sink a little bit as water begins to undermine that curbstone. The curbs are also in odd formation as they are also leaning, but it's just a general lack of maintenance that was during that time. Another photo from 1880, you can see the same thing here. The curbs aren't really uniform. The brick sidewalk is not really uniform either. You can see under the awning that there's actually a pile of cobblestones that have been pulled up as people have stopped by the Betteridge Fancy Goods store. And then moving into 1890, we have this photograph that shows the south sidewalk for one of the earliest photographs of the south side sidewalk, Cobblestone Road, and once again that north sidewalk is still brick. Because of the quality of this photograph, it's difficult to discern the status of the brick and the curbs. However, I love this photo because it shows that dirt path and shows kind of that juxtaposition of the sidewalks that we typically see, where one sidewalk is one material and the other side is another material. You can also very clearly see the wagon ruts and carriage ruts in the cobblestones as well. So when we get to 1900, disrepair is evident in the street, even more so with piles of cobbles and bricks. So circled is a pile of bricks next to the house. This is, I believe, 5 Liberty, if I'm remembering correctly. And then a pile of cobblestones in the street. You can see that the street is very uneven. Where it meets the curb is a little displaced, and the utility pole is either being replaced or had just been replaced. So you can see the other utility pole laying down a little bit. But that is, the utility pole regardless is still causing the material to kind of bubble up around it. So it's pulling up some of that street material still. Again, in 1900, moving a little bit further down the road, we have a different view. This time the sidewalk is brick. There's still stone curbs. There's a fire hydrant, and the road is paved. It's not cobblestone. And this is similar to what we see today. So it was kind of surprising to see, oh, well, so it happened sometime around when this photo was taken. In 1910, moving back towards the Methodist Church, there's a utility pole at the corner, cobblestones, roads, and a brick sidewalk in front of the Methodist Church. They also still have that wall. In 1953, there is an asphalt road, brick sidewalk, and bollards still in place in front of 5 Liberty Street. However, in front of it now is asphalt, and it's asphalt all the way down. You can follow that line and not see a bump of a cobblestone. So that means at some point in time, the cobblestone was covered over or removed completely for asphalt. in its stead. And then now we have that kind of transition from cobblestone to asphalt on Liberty Street, which did not exist in the 1953 photo. So here we have 1964. The bollard is still in place in front of 5 Liberty Street. The road is still asphalt. The sidewalk is brick. As a matter of fact, this brick sidewalk is in a different pattern. It is now in what's known as a herringbone pattern, which is similar to what is known fashionably. But it's only in front of the house. And that is also similar to what exists today. It's that herringbone pattern. And so looking at our materials, there are brick sidewalks, stone curbs, asphalt, and cobblestone road. And the road material transitions from cobblestone to asphalt between 5 and 9 Liberty Street, or directly across if you drew a line from the corner of 4 Liberty Street, directly across. We measured 6 sections, so we did 6 parcels. The length of area surveyed was 437.82 feet. The average width of the sidewalk completely, it was 7.87 feet. So it's a little bit wider than what we experienced on Winter Street, excuse me. Our utilities are signposts, electric accesses, broadband access, utility poles, water meters, utility covers, and the fire hydrant that was photographed historically as well. But our accessibility is tight spaces and vehicles parking on the sidewalk. So it's not driving, it's parking. There is minimal utility intrusion, so it is really easy to navigate the sidewalk when there's not cars parked on it, because the sidewalks are wide, and so that allows plenty of room. But with the cars parked on the sidewalk, especially during the summer, this causes a massive issue of it's difficult to get between a car and a house, or a rock and a hard place, essentially. I witnessed many people with their suitcases walking down Liberty Street, trying to squeeze between the two as they try to get into town or out of town. So what we see is technically one side is supposed to be accessible, but it's not. So if you're going from the corner of Liberty and Center, and you're trying to turn the corner at the Pacific Bank, which is what's circled, it is 1 brick, so 8 inches wide, and 1 curb, which is 4 inches roundabout. So you have a foot of passage, which isn't accessible. And then even further down, if you somehow managed to navigate that, you have about 2.5 feet of distance across, which is also not enough space for somebody who may be in a wheelchair or use an assistive device that needs a little bit of extra room. So this is an accessibility concern for Liberty Street. On one side, you have parked cars that are not easy to get between, that don't have enough room. On the other side, you can't even access the sidewalk for somebody who may need a device to help them with that. And so with that, we're moving into the next section, which is a visual preference survey. And we really want you to take it. So you'll see on the screen is a QR code eventually when we get to the next slide right after the next one. If you could just scan it with your iPhone or phone camera and click on the link and take the survey. It takes about 5 to 8 minutes. We would really appreciate it. That's one way to add some input into this project. So what exactly is a visual preference survey? We've realized that a lot of people may have not taken it or may have not known what it was called. And it's essentially a public opinion survey. So we are asking you to evaluate photos and rank them. So this is an example from a historic district elsewhere. And basically their ranking level was, I hate it to I love it. And it was just a series of questions, really simple. It doesn't take a long time to do. What we're looking at is, of course, our historic streetscape. So we're going on level of appropriateness. Is it not appropriate? Is it appropriate? Does it look safe? Does it not look safe? How do you feel about it? And so what we're using is the Historic Preservation Guideline of Integrity. And this is the ability of a property to convey its historical associations or attributes. So how does it feel historic? How does it present its historicness, if you will? There's technically 7 aspects to integrity, but we're concerned about 2 of them. The first is materials. And these are physical elements that are character defining for the historic resources. So this could be brick, this could be the granite or the schist or concrete or asphalt, those types of things. And we're really asking you to consider historic precedents, accessibility benefit, and visual appropriateness. And this will also ask questions concerning ADA compliance. And so looking at materials that help with accessibility and whether you would find those appropriate for Nantucket. Also looking at design. That includes orientation, use, and function that are character defining for historic resources. Once again, looking at that historic precedence, scale, function, and accessibility. And then the final section is pedestrian feeling, safety, visual appearance, and comments on your experience. Do you always trip at the same place every single time you walk down a street? Have you fallen and chipped a tooth? We had a student who fell and I believe sprained or broke parts of her leg a few years ago, and those kinds of things. And looking at how we experience our streetscapes today, how our sidewalks work for us or potentially work against us. And like I said, this takes about 5 to 8 minutes. There's 19 questions. There is space for you to explain your answers if you would like. There is also space for you to include an email and your name if you would like to talk more, if we find that we would like to ask questions. Of course, you don't have to do that. So upcoming, this survey will be available until March 11th. Once again, there's the QR code, and there will be potential interviews if we find your answers to be particularly interesting and we would like to talk more about them if you are comfortable with that. Like I said, you can provide your name or email. It's not required at all. There is also a deadline for the final plan, which is March 30th. There will also be a draft available. Of course, we are working on the GIS database in order to make it as publicly accessible as possible. And then there will be a final public engagement event. Date and time will be determined soon. So I would like to thank you all for attending this event. If you would like, we would love to have an open dialogue with you and talk about streetscapes. You can leave comments or ask questions on Zoom. It'll be on the bottom toolbar. Again, my name is Kimberly Rose. I am the co-director of the Preservation Institute Nantucket. There is my email if you would like to email me with any information, or if you have photos or know something that I did not find in my research, feel free to reach out. And thank you again for attending.
You can also use the chat if that's a little bit easier for you, but I'm keeping my eye on the Q&A. And also, I did put this in the chat, but if you're listening and you want that link, what I'll do is everyone who registered, I'll send you a link to the recording once it's ready, and a link to, I'm assuming there's a link to the survey, right?
I'm putting the link to the survey in the chat right now.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
So I just put that link in the link in the chat will take you to the survey.
I don't. Wow, I think we overwhelmed everyone with questions. I did see a hand up, so hold on.
Yes.
If you want to put your hand back up, I will unmute you if I can find you. Once again. Okay, Liz Sutton, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. See if I can hear you. Liz, I don't know if I can hear you. It might be easier if you put your question in the Q&A. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I was gonna mute people, but I don't think I can hear you. So I'm gonna ask you to put it in the chat or the Q&A.
That works.
So let's see if I can fit.
Yeah. So Paula asks, how will findings or support be used? How will these findings be used, or will they be used to support the sewer work when it commences on India Liberty Winter?
Yeah, so that was one of the reasons why we chose Winter Street, is to work with the folks that are doing that work in order to get them the information on how to sensitively replace, replace those materials once they might be disturbed in the best way possible. So how to bed those materials, how to treat those materials, and even if they need to, how to label those materials as well. And so to help with that process and give them the best information that we could possibly provide when it comes to how to change and treat those. And like I said, Winter Street has undergone a lot of change. So how to manage that process.
We have a question, a couple in the Q&A. I have a question about brick as a material. Bricks look different in color, shape, and size.
Mm-hmm.
How do we determine which brick is right for Nantucket when new brick is called for?
So that's a really good question. And there's some discussion about wire cut bricks versus traditional molded bricks, and really doing the research about what has traditionally been used. So what does Nantucket use currently, or what has it used historically? Where is that clay from? Because it also has to do with geology and what works best for our climate as well, because bricks can become inundated with water. They can spall and crack and become damaged, and they take compression differently. And so it really just depends on what that sidewalk would be used. Like, for instance, on the side of the Coffin School, if that sidewalk is going to continue to be driven on, Nantucket might consider a stronger brick that won't crack as much. Or a different bedding material to support that brick if it's going to continue to take loads of heavy vehicles, so that you don't get the different formations and the damage that we're seeing to the bricks on that side of the street.
There's a question in the chat. I will be repairing a private cobblestone way, Gull Island. It currently connects to an asphalt apron and then the street. Is there any guidance on installing a brick sidewalk instead of the asphalt? Are there any best practices guidelines anywhere?
Not to my knowledge. So really what we were focused on this project is the sidewalks. There was a previous project done by the Nantucket Historical Commission that studied the cobblestones specifically, and they had a firm come out and look at that. And that report is available online. I don't know, Mary, if you know of any other resources?
No, I know that is something that the HTC seems to struggle with, but trying to, I should say the HTC, but when people are applying to the HTC, but it does seem to be a question of what sort of apron should you have to match.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, just from what I witnessed, it seems to be a lot of what is already pre-existing in the neighborhood that people take their cues from. But as Kim, points out throughout the study, so much of what we have thought was always there was not always there. Mm-hmm. So I think that the aprons is perhaps the next step to look at. I'm going to look up that Nantucket Historical Commission doc that you referenced in that chat as well.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
We have a question. We have some time. Someone asked, accessibility and historic integrity seems at odds. While you were working on this, what ideas occurred to you while you're working in the field regarding making the sidewalks more accessible?
So it's not so much the integrity is at odds, it's more of how it's maintained. So the more you maintain, sidewalks are meant to be flat. They are meant to be even ground. They're not meant to be driven on. They're meant to be accessible. And so having and serve the widest range of people possible. And so if we're looking at that historic purpose of a sidewalk, then it's not that far off of looking at integrity, because technically sidewalks that aren't serving that purpose don't have that much integrity if they're not able to. But also looking at materials. Brick can be accessible, but that is about managing how much of a gap is between it and making sure that wheelchair wheels or walker wheels or assistive devices like visual assistant aid canes won't fall into the cracks and confuse somebody or help or make somebody get stuck or whatnot. And it's really just about being sensitive and recognizing, okay, so, you know, we have this crosswalk, but once you get to the other side of the crosswalk, there's this curb and there's a 3-inch rise that a wheelchair could not get over. Maybe we need to lower that back down to the ground. And it's just because some materials change and streetscapes do change slowly. So we do not always recognize when they have started to change because it happens within the field of human time, which we don't look long-term. We have historically very short-sighted frames of reference. And that's why with historic preservation, we look at 50 years because typically that's when people are like, oh yeah, that's old. But then you have things like this, which is a asphalt sidewalk, which technically is not aesthetically pleasing. However, historic preservation isn't always about aesthetics. It's about what's historically there. And this sidewalk was historically paved in asphalt and then brick all the way up to the Academy Hill. So it just depends on the perspective of the people making those decisions.
Don't see anything else.
Yeah. And once again, there's still the QR code on the slide. So you can still scan that and that'll take you to the survey as well. We appreciate your participation in that.
While we wait, last call for questions. Pam, I do see your hand up, but I don't think I can unmute you. So if you want to put your question or comment in the chat or the Q&A, that'd be great. And just a quick plug, tomorrow at 6 here in the Learning Lab in person, masks required. We're going to have our first in the 8-part series called Strong Towns. It's their local motive tour. And tomorrow's topic is 10 strong town questions to ask someone running for office. So all of these will lead up to the annual town meeting. It's a number of different topics. You can find them all on our website, but I would love for people to be there. You can register, but you can also just show up if you like. And it's tomorrow here in the Learning Lab on the lower level at the Athenaeum at 6 p.m. Perfect. And I don't see any other questions, but I see a few thank yous. So thank you, Kim.
Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. And also, once again, you can email me at kimberlyrose@ufl.edu. I'm also around town, often taking photos of flooding or sidewalks or whatnot, depending on what project I'm working on at the time. So, and once again, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Preservation Institute. So make sure to check that out on our website. You can Google University of Florida Historic Preservation Program and it's available on our website. Perfect.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Kim.